Imagine standing in a narrow mountain valley, the air still cool before dawn, the silence broken only by the distant thud of hooves and the low rhythmic murmur of tens of thousands of men preparing themselves for war. The year is 1896. The place is the highlands of northern Ethiopia. Near a small town called Adwa, General Vittorio Dabomeda's column moved through a ravine choked with brush and rock, the men sweating under their uniforms, despite the early morning chill, their rifles heavy on their shoulders. The Italian high command was confident. The campaign had been long and frustrating, but today, they believed, would end it. From the mountain heights above the valley floor, the Ethiopian warriors had been watching since the night before. The roar of rifle fire erupted across the hills. Ethiopian cavalry burst from concealed positions and crashed into the flanks of Dabomeda's column. War drums thundered through the mountain air. The battle cries of Ethiopian warriors echoed off stone ridges and rolled down into the valleys below. Within minutes, what had been a confident Italian advance became something else entirely, a catastrophe in motion. In the final decades of the 19th century, the map of Africa was being redrawn, not by Africans, but by Europeans. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, the major powers of Europe gathered in a German city to divide an entire continent among themselves. Britain controlled vast swaths of East and Southern Africa. France dominated much of the West and North. Belgium carved out the Congo. Italy was late to the scramble. Newly unified as a nation only since 1861, Italy was hungry to prove itself on the world stage. Italian forces had established a foothold along the Red Sea coast in the 1880s, creating the colony of Eritrea from coastal territories and port towns. The man who would stand against that ambition was one of the most remarkable leaders of the 19th century. Menelik II had been born in 1844, the son of the king of the province of Shewa. He escaped, reclaimed his father's throne, built alliances across the fragmented Ethiopian highlands, and in 1889 he became emperor of all Ethiopia. Menelik II was a strategist in every sense of the word. He understood that the colonial powers of Europe were advancing, and he understood that if Ethiopia was to survive as an independent nation, it would need to be militarily prepared and diplomatically sophisticated. In 1889, Italy and Ethiopia signed the Treaty of Wuchale. On the surface, it appeared to be a straightforward agreement establishing trade relations. Article 17 of the treaty, in the Italian version, stated that Ethiopia was obliged to conduct all of its foreign affairs through the Italian government, making Ethiopia, in effect, an Italian protectorate. When Italy began informing European powers that Ethiopia was now an Italian protectorate, Menelik was furious. In 1893, after years of protests and diplomatic correspondence that went nowhere, Menelik formally renounced the Treaty of Wuchale in its entirety. If you're finding this story compelling, the kind of history that doesn't get told enough, go ahead and hit that like button below and subscribe to the channel. Menelik sent word to every regional lord, every Aras and Dejaz map across the Ethiopian highlands, calling them to gather their forces in march. Estimates of the total Ethiopian force that eventually gathered vary among historians, but most agree it numbered somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 men. Empress Taitu Betul, Menelik's wife and co-ruler, played a central role in organizing the logistics of the campaign. She organized the transport of food supplies across difficult mountain terrain, oversaw logistical planning, and would ultimately be present at the battle itself, commanding her own troops. At its core were the professional soldiers and cavalry of the imperial household and the regional lords. Surrounding these were tens of thousands of fighters carrying a mix of weapons, traditional spears, shields, and swords alongside modern repeating rifles. France and Russia, both with reasons to see Italian ambitions in East Africa frustrated, had supplied arms through back channels. Despite having established their colony in Eritrea and having pushed forces into northern Ethiopia, the Italians had suffered a sharp defeat at the Battle of Amba Alagi in December 1895. General Oreste Baratieri, the commander of Italian forces in Eritrea, was under enormous political pressure from Rome. The Italian plan called for 3 columns to advance simultaneously through the mountainous terrain toward the Ethiopian position near Adwa, coordinating their movements to strike the Ethiopian camp in a combined assault. The maps the Italian commanders were using were inaccurate. The terrain around Adwa was far more complex and difficult than Italian intelligence had indicated. Their scouts had been watching the Italian positions for weeks. Menelik and his senior commanders knew exactly where the Italian columns were, how fast they were moving, and what routes they would likely use. Dawn on March 1st, 1896, broke over the mountains of Tigray with an otherworldly calm. Mist hung in the valleys. The air smelled of red earth and dry scrub. The three Italian columns, Dabormida on the right, Aramandi in the center, and Elena on the left, pushed forward through the darkness and into the early morning light. The distances between the columns were greater than planned. The terrain had separated them far more than the map suggested. Menelik saw his opportunity. From the heights above the valley, he watched the Italian columns separate, stretch, and lose their coherence. With the practiced eye of a commander who had spent decades fighting wars across the Ethiopian highlands, he recognized the moment. He ordered the attack. The Ethiopian forces did not simply charge down the mountainside in a disorganized mass. They moved in coordinated waves with different commanders striking different parts of the Italian line at different moments. Ras Mikkel, commanding forces from Wollo, struck at one end of the Italian line. Ras Makonnen led his troops in a devastating flanking assault. Ras Makonen's cavalry crashed into Dabormida's exposed right flank with a ferocity that shattered the column's formation within minutes. Dabormida himself was killed during the engagement, one of several senior Italian officers who died that day. Without his leadership, the column's resistance collapsed. Men broke and ran, only to find that the terrain that had been so disorienting on the march was equally disorienting in flight. Aramondi's column, still struggling through the middle terrain, suddenly found itself facing the full weight of the Ethiopian center under Menelik's personal command. The emperor himself was present on the battlefield, not watching from a distance, but actively commanding, rallying his forces, and directing the flow of the battle. Within hours, their resistance had collapsed as well. General Aramondi was killed in the fighting. Elena's column, realizing what was happening to the other two, attempted to withdraw. The withdrawal quickly became a rout. By midday, the Battle of Adwa was effectively over. Approximately 6,000 Italian soldiers and officers were killed, a death toll that represented almost half the force that had advanced that morning. Thousands more were captured and held as prisoners in Ethiopia. When news of the defeat reached Rome, the reaction was a combination of shock, grief, and political chaos. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi was forced to resign within days. No European power had suffered a defeat of this magnitude at the hands of an African force in the age of colonial expansion. The world had seen nothing quite like it. For Africans and people of African descent around the world, the victory at Adwa was electrifying. Ethiopian flags began appearing in communities across the African diaspora. The name Menelik II became a symbol of defiance and dignity in a world that offered very little of either to black people at the end of the 19th century. Italy was forced to negotiate with Ethiopia from a position of weakness. The resulting Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed in October 1896, required Italy to formally recognize Ethiopia as a fully independent and sovereign state. Don't go anywhere. The most dramatic moment of this entire story is just ahead. In 1896, the same year as Adwa, Britain was suppressing resistance across the Gold Coast. France was completing its conquest of Madagascar. Menelik had refused to make those mistakes. He had armed his forces with modern weapons. He had gathered an overwhelming numerical superiority. He had chosen terrain that neutralized Italian tactical advantages. The role of Empress II in all of this cannot be understated. She had argued passionately that surrendering sovereignty would set Ethiopia on the path toward the fate that had befallen so many other African kingdoms. European powers did not conquer Africa simply because of technological superiority. They conquered because they exploited internal divisions, because they offered deals and concessions to local leaders. Menelik had refused every one of these traps. He had united the regional powers of Ethiopia behind a single purpose. On March 1st, 1896, in the mountains near a small town called Adwa, the Ethiopian Empire changed history. They didn't just win a battle, they proved a truth that would echo across the next century of human struggle. That empire is not inevitable, that colonial power is not invincible, and that the people it tries to consume are never as passive as weak or as easily defeated as those empires need them to be. Menelik II received diplomatic delegations from across Europe. Nations that had previously dismissed Ethiopia as a target for colonization now sent ambassadors. The Italian prisoners captured at Adwa were treated, by the standards of the time, with notable consideration. General Baratieri, the commander of the failed campaign, was court-martialed for his role in the disaster. If you've made it this far in the story, you're exactly the kind of history lover this channel was built for. Please hit that subscribe button. The Battle of Adwa stands today as one of the defining moments in the history of African resistance to colonialism. It was not simply a military engagement, it was a statement. Menelik II lived until 1913, ruling Ethiopia through decades of continued pressure and transformation. Empress Taitu remained a powerful figure at court. The Ethiopia they had defended remained independent for another 4 decades after Adwa. And even when Benito Mussolini's Italy invaded in 1935, the memory of Adwa was the flame that kept Ethiopian resistance alive. The day an African army crushed a European empire was also the day the world began, slowly, painfully, incompletely, to understand something it had long refused to believe.